Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us here today. We'll get started in just one more minute, but we'll pull up the deck to get us ready. Thank you again for being here.
All right, I think we're ready to get started, everyone. Good morning. Or I guess it's afternoon now, not morning, but my name is Kiana Trabue. I currently serve as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at BI3, which is Bethesda Inc.'s grant-making initiative to transform health and healthcare in our region. I am super excited to welcome you all to the second session of this advocacy and lobbying series. Hopefully you had the opportunity to attend the first session, which was a great kickoff for us. And this session will just build upon what was shared in the first session. Today's topic is different governments, different approaches, and it will be led by Janae Bradley and Holly Hankinson. So you'll hear from them a little bit later. We want to make sure that the session is as engaging as possible. So if you're okay with it, we do ask that you please keep your camera on during the session, but we also understand if you're not comfortable with that, and that's fine. We are also recording this session, so we're asking that you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking, so that we can reduce as much background noise as possible. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please feel free to utilize the chat feature. We will be monitoring that throughout the session. And then also there will be time for Q&A at the end of the session for you to ask your questions or make comments. I would like to recognize all the partners who have come together to make this series possible. It started with an idea and has blossomed into this wonderful series that we're able to present to you all today. So All In Cincinnati, BI3, Cohere, Cradle Cincinnati, Gen H, United Way of Greater Cincinnati, the Women's Fund of Greater Cincinnati Foundation, and Youth at the Center. We all came together and have this understanding that equitable policies and practices build equitable communities. And we also know that nonprofits have a tremendous opportunity to help build out those equitable policies and practices through advocacy. And so we wanted to be able to equip you all with the resources and knowledge to do so. We are specifically centering Black women in this work because research shows us again and again that Black women experience the most challenges and barriers along their journey to health, overall well-being, and self-sufficiency. And we know that when we lift Black women, there will be positive impacts for all people, and our entire community will prosper as a result. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Sean, who's going to give us an overview of the series, and then also share some additional information about what you will hear today, and then also a poll for you all to participate in. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kiana, and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to session 2 of our lobbying and advocacy series. So it's session 1 last time. For those who weren't able to be here, it was videotaped, so you were able to watch the recording. But we started off talking about what's the role each of us can play and how change happens. And then Mike Morosky really walked through the basics of lobbying and advocacy and gave some really great resources, particularly for nonprofit 501c3 organizations around what you can do and what you're not able to do. But there's a lot you are able to do around affecting and impacting policies. Today's session 2 is going to be about different governments, different approaches. And then coming up in August, and we'll have a July off, but we'll be back in August for Advocacy Works, really having organizations hopefully develop a plan. So after we've done our 3 foundational pieces, really hopefully you'll be able to have a plan for your organization or your community group that you're representing. And then prior to the election, we'll be having a candidate forum in October that will really have us an opportunity to hear about different folks. So today's for different governments, different approaches. We're really excited that Janae Bradley from United Way and Holly Hankinson from the Women's Fund at GCF are going to be really leading through our pieces today, and also Dunny Isaacson from Cohere is also going to be talking about the importance of hearing community voices. We're really going to be looking at local, state, and federal, and that, as it says here, different governments each maybe require a little bit of a different approach for that. So with that in mind, we're going to actually start today with a poll, and I'm going to share. This poll is going to require you to have a little bit of using technology if you're not familiar with Mentimeter. And so either on your phone or on a web browser, if you're on your computer, you can type in this address you see at the top, menti.com, and use the code 99837483. And this will be a word cloud. We just want to get a sense of where people are coming from. So if you're in the city of Cincinnati and you're one of the 52 neighborhoods, feel free to put that neighborhood. If you're outside of the city, just put the community or city that you live in, or township. And if technology is not being your friend today and Mentimeter is not working for you, you can also put it in the chat if you would like to be represented. Thanks, Ebony. We also have Norwood represented. Anderson, great. And so if you're not familiar with Mentimeter, Van Wert, awesome. So also the neighborhood or community, the word cloud, kind of the more people who fill it out, the larger the word is on the screen. Cool. Give you about another 10, 15 seconds before we get to our next question. We're excited and really appreciate seeing folks from all over, because this is also helping us and our presenters today really know where, how can they focus, where people might be looking at if they're looking at it, for their different local aspects. Awesome. So our second question for today is wanting to know, for your organization, which level does your organization primarily currently focus its advocacy and lobbying efforts? Is it more on the local, state, or federal? You can select multiple options. Or if you've not started yet, if you are in the ground, just at the ground stages, feel free to let us know that as well, so we get an idea of where people are focusing. We have a couple locals in the chat as well. At all levels. Okay. Just want to send a special shout out as well, since to all those lobbying at the state level for all of your work with the statewide budget, which we know has been a moving kind of like a whack-a-mole game of trying to address a number of things popping up, but awesome. Cool. Thanks out. Sister Sally says all three as well, depending on organization and issue. So great. So this gives us a little bit of idea. So we've got a lot of local, a lot of state, a few federal, and a few people who are just starting out. So we appreciate you all taking time to check in and start off with today's presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Denny.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here and see so many familiar and so many new faces. I'm going to speak on something that, for those of you who know me, I'm a broken record about, but I do think it's a really important thing to consider in any, not just lobbying and advocacy, but any sort of effort to move any change really at all, which is that the people, you can refer to them in different ways, but the people closest to the issues, the people most impacted by the issues. At Cohere, we call them the everyday experts, the people who have the expertise that comes from living an issue, have to be, or should be, I think, at the center of efforts to do lobbying and advocacy work. And so what often happens is there's a lot of incredible organizations, many of whom are represented on this call, who, do the work of advocating on behalf of communities, because people have to work, they have to raise their families, they have to, earn a living. So people cannot be expected to just advocate for themselves on all the issues that they can. But the part of the job, I think, of doing this well is taking a step back before every advocacy and lobbying effort and asking, how can we most effectively and meaningfully incorporate the voices and also the ideas of the everyday experts, the people with lived experience, into this process. And what's so important to realize is that when you're to recognize is that when you're lobbying and advocating, fundamentally, you're usually talking to politicians. And there is no group of people more sensitive to effective personal stories than politicians, because they know how powerful they are because they use them to get elected. And so when, we don't do lobbying and advocacy work, but we have been engaged in some aspects of that process a couple of times, but I've seen it happen a lot. We connect our everyday experts to issues they care a lot about. It was very nice to see some of them speaking with Senator Sherrod Brown yesterday on advocating for childcare with the Women's Fund. And I think that was a great example of how powerful this can be. So one quick example of how this works, or how we've seen it work. There's a city council member last year or 2 years ago who was pushing for some improved renter legislation, but it had some pushback, and he was going in front of the Enquirer's editorial board, which carries some weight particularly with the business community. And so before that, he sat down and had a facilitated lunch and meeting where he heard from people who this legislation would impact and who would potentially benefit from it. And based on their feedback, and he asked afterwards, a couple of the people in the room who were most enthusiastic about the legislation, hey, would you be willing to come with me to the Enquirer's editorial board meeting? And if he had just gone by himself, or he had just gone with a legal aid attorney who works in housing issues, it would have been a much less compelling meeting than the fact that he brought with him and actually let speak and share their own reasons for their enthusiasm to people who were going to be impacted by this legislation. And the Enquirer eventually gave it a full-throated endorsement. And in the endorsement, they noted, we are giving this endorsement because of the powerful testimony of the people who are going to benefit from this legislation. And so you have to have that human element to really connect, even if the legislation is for 11 million people, in Ohio, or, at the federal level. Ultimately, it's, and you'll see, politicians do this, good politicians do this so well. And so I think good lobbying and advocacy efforts should seek to do the same. That's my plug for incorporating everyday expertise.
Thank you so much, Donnie, for sharing your work. And we'll go back into our training. And I think that piece really dovetails into the rest of the conversation that we're going to have today around effective lobbying and advocacy. So we wanted to make sure that we started with that primer as we continued our conversation. So in our first training, we heard a bit about the differences between advocacy and lobbying, and it was a great primer for that conversation. In this training, we're lifting up strategies for engagement, and in many ways, they're similar, whether you're lobbying or advocating for an issue. So we may use those terms interchangeably, but know that we're talking about both. Additionally, in that first training, Mike did a really great job of laying out some strategies for engagement, including understanding which governmental body it is that you're seeking to address and the issue that you're addressing. And we recommend that you go back and look at that information, and we'll seek not to duplicate too much of that information in today's training. Before we dive into the content of different governments, different approaches, we wanted to lay this foundation of things that you should consider before you dive into this work. And the first is identifying your issue. So understanding if you have a very specific goal or a more general one. So are you advocating for a very specific issue like increasing the child care reimbursement rates, or something broader like advocating for affordable housing? Knowing what your goal is going to be important as you continue to move forward. Secondly, it's important for you to identify your strengths. Understand what your organization brings to the table. So are you a group that's really great at organizing at the grassroots level? Do you have expertise in gathering data or research? Or do you have the ability to leverage your relationships in a really positive way? Understanding your strengths is important, and also not only knowing how you play a role, but who you may want to partner with to help you carry out your work and fill in those gaps. And thirdly, identifying your capacity. Whether you're advocating for a specific issue or lobbying for a specific bill, all of that takes time. So you want to really be aware of how much time you have to dedicate to these resources, and additionally, who you're going to put behind it. Building on Dunny's comments, you have this mass of everyday experts that you can bring in to your advocacy efforts, as well as volunteers, board members, and other members of your staff. Building on that, there are also, sorry about that. Building on that, there are also a few tips that you may want to consider as you get started. The first one is perhaps the most important, and that is you do not have to be an expert at everything. In training one, Mike mentioned that lawmakers aren't experts in every area, and that's why it's important to have the voices of folks like you at the table to inform the work that they're doing. At the same time, you do not need to be an expert in every space. Really understand where your expertise exists and really build connections with others to fill those gaps. So if you're someone that's really great at gathering research, but you may not have connections with lawmakers, find someone that has those connections. If you're really great at bringing groups of people together, but you don't have the technical expertise in data and research, find an organization that does that. This also connects into the second point of coalitions being key. There's a popular phrase that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And this is especially true in the advocacy and lobbying space. So find those coalitions, whether they exist at the federal, state, or local level. Find people that have shared interests as you. And we know that advocacy and policy is the long game, and it also takes time to build those coalitions and relationships, but it will definitely be worthwhile, not only in being able to have a collection of diverse voices, but also different points of view on the issue that you're advocating for. And finally, advocacy takes many forms. So at a high level, we have three forms of advocacy. So legislative, where you're looking to get something put into place. Regulatory, where you're looking at a policy that's put in place and ensuring that it's enacted in the way that makes the most sense and is beneficial to your constituencies, as well as budgetary advocacy, which is trying to get your issue or your item in the budget. Additionally, there are different strategies to support advocacy. So it's not just sending an email to your legislator or making a call. And we'll talk through that last piece throughout our training. I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Holly Hankinson, to give a quick civics overview.
Thank you so much, Janae. And as Janae mentioned, we are going to talk a little bit about who makes these decisions. So we're going to take you back to social studies class, maybe in high school, and talk through sort of what decisions are made at the different levels of government. So we're going to go quickly. This is not going to be complete, obviously, but just to kind of give you a background before we move forward. So the first level we're going to talk about is the federal level. Here we are mostly talking about the House of Representatives and the Senate. As we all know, there are 435 members in the House, 100 in the Senate. And what this means is the Senate has a much larger staff than the House. That's something to think about. They have on average 40 staff members. The House has 15. So that district size correlates to that staff size. And it's important to remember that in the district, those district offices can sometimes be really responsive to local needs. So think about those district offices as well as the offices in DC. They also have a little bit of different roles within the legislature. So, appointments and treaties start in the Senate. Every budget bill starts in the House of Representatives. So all the money bills start in the House. Many organizations may receive federal money. There's a lot of government funding that flows sort of through the state and local governments to social service agencies, often through federal block grants. So there's opportunities to advocate at the federal level as well as the local and state on funding issues. So at the federal level, as we know, that both a bill must pass in both chambers of Congress and be signed by the president to become a law. Between 2019 and 2021, there were over 16,000 bills introduced. Only 344%, which is 2% of those bills, were signed into law. So that is a very, very small percentage, and that's not unique to that 2-year period. Over the last 10 years, only 2 or 3% of bills were signed into law. You can go to the next slide. There we go. So at the state level, unlike, we're going to do a little bit of a constitutional law lesson here. The 10th Amendment provides that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So that's a very fancy way of saying that the state has a lot of power to make the laws. So unless the Constitution says it's for the federal government, the states can really cover pretty much any area that they want to. So that's not exactly what the Constitution says, but we don't exactly have the right constitutional scholar to go in depth. So we just really wanted to highlight that the states have a lot of broad authority. So, a few examples here that they do create laws in. They do elections, state highways, they establish welfare programs, they collect taxes, they do a lot. Often the state sets the rules that local governments follow. So it creates rules and regulations for specific government programs as well. So at the local level, here we're talking about county and city governments in Ohio. Other states may be a little bit different. We're talking about Ohio local governments. So in Ohio counties, they don't have home rule authority. So what that means is they can only do what the Ohio General Assembly gives them the power to do. So this is a little bit like the federal government. The federal government can only do what the Constitution says it can do. The county government can only do what the Ohio General Assembly gives them the power to do. So because of this, they have more limited legislative powers than cities do. So they do things like, they can do taxes, manage taxes, budgets. They manage like planning and zoning departments. They operate the jobs and family services departments in each county. And so for this reason, because of this limited legislative authority, they seem a little bit more administrative than the city governments, who have much broader legislative powers. So they can pass any local law as long as those laws don't conflict with state or federal legislation. So this is like those state governments, they have much broader authority here. They, cover things like police and fire, transportation, affordable housing and development, and they manage a lot of neighborhood issues as well. So now I'm going to pass it back to Janae to talk about some engagement strategies for each.
Thank you, Holly, for that great Civics 101 lesson. So we're going to talk about those federal, state, and local engagement strategies, starting at the federal level. So when we talk about federal advocacy, we're most often talking about the Senate and the House of Representatives. However, there are other areas where you can engage in federal level advocacy, including submitting a comment to a proposed rule or regulation by an executive or independent agency. When we think about advocacy at the federal level, there are some distinct pros and some cons. On the pro side, it's fairly easy to plug in if you have limited time. There are lots of organizations and coalitions that are doing work to mobilize groups to advocate at the federal level that have simple strategies such as filling out a form email or calling your legislator. At the same time, on the con side, it may be hard to see your direct impact because there are so many different inputs coming in that you won't know exactly how your contribution influenced that decision. As a highlight, there's always an issue that touches your work since the purview of the federal government is very expansive. But at the same time, the landscape is fairly complicated. And if you're focused on an issue that may have some nuance to it, it may be hard to navigate in that space if you don't have an expert along that journey with you. Connected to the federal government touching so many areas of our lives, we see that there are big dollars at stake. Some of the dollars that are passing through the state and the local branches of government are controlled by the federal government. But it may be challenging to get a meeting with your decision maker because there are so many other people vying for that federal decision maker's time. But there are some things that we can consider as we look to influence our members of Congress. All In Together, a national group looking to support women being in the advocacy and policy space, polled members of Congress to get an understanding of how their influence or their decisions are influenced by community members and what types of inputs really help to influence their decisions. So what we can see from this chart is that there's a correlation between the type of advocacy that takes more time and effort and is personalized and the impact or influence it has on Congress members in making decisions, where in-person issue visits from a constituent is going to have a greater impact on that Congress member than a form email message. However, you can see that all of these forms, whether it's an individualized email or a phone call, have some level of impact. So we ask that you consider all of these different strategies. But it's not only important of how you're reaching out to the members of Congress, it also matters what you're saying. So this poll looks at what's included in messages and how big of an influence it has on those members of Congress, as well as that gray bar showing you how frequently messages include that information. And what we see here is that perhaps the most influential are messages that include information about the impact of that the bill would have on a district or state. But only 9% of the time do messages to Congress members include that type of information. Same for personal story related to the bill or the issue. That has a sizable influence on Congress members, but only about 18% of messages that they're receiving include that information. So as you're shaping your message, not only consider what pathway or what process you're using to get that message to the member of the Congress, also consider what's consisted in that message.
So we're going to talk about a few engagement strategies at the federal level. So for everyone, whether you're in an organization or not, it's important to remember that you contact your senator and your member of Congress. That's based on where you live. So there are obviously some members and senators that are more powerful than others, but we would say that unless you live in New York or Kentucky, don't contact Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell. They, might be very powerful and have a lot of influence. However, if you're not their constituent, it's not their job to listen to what you have to say. So make sure you're focusing on your representatives. Anyone can do this, obviously, whether you're part of an organization or not. For those organizations specifically, we recommend, developing deeper relationships with those district offices. As an organization, you're an expert on whatever issue you're working on. Senators and members of Congress, a lot of times they host events and issues on issues they care about in their home districts, and they work with their local staff to help plan these events. If those district offices know you, if you've built that relationship with them, they're going to start to make those connections to you and make and work with you on, creating these events with them and inviting you to these events. It makes them look really good to their boss if they have a great group of organizations that they work with, and it really gives you an opportunity to share your stories with this office and your members and your senators. And I can give you a quick example that Denny actually mentioned earlier. So, at the Women's Fund, we've developed a relationship with Senator Sherrod Brown's local Cincinnati office over the past few years, and we've worked with them on a few different events. He was in town yesterday, and last week they reached out to us because we've worked with them before to host a press conference and a roundtable event on the child tax credit payments with him. So, because we had built that relationship, they had an hour in his schedule and they wanted, some help creating a roundtable. And so we were able to, put the event together for them. And so we, not only helped them out by putting this event together, we had the opportunity to share some of our advocacy priorities and work directly with the senator himself, which, finding that time and the opportunity to have that face-to-face meeting can be challenging sometimes. If another option is inviting elected officials and staff to your facility. So if you're a direct service provider, consider inviting them to your facility for a tour. Timing is important here. So thinking about when they're not in session, often you have a better chance of the member actually coming themselves. When they come to your facility, you have time to go deeper on an issue and show off sort of your work and the people you work with. They love this. These members and representatives will talk about this when they're in the community. It makes them look great to spend time sort of in the organizations, in the districts where they live. And in general, most elected officials are extroverts. They love to be around people. They love to talk to people. So these are great opportunities to start building those relationships. So these tips are sort of in our federal sort of bucket, but they really do apply to elected officials across the board. So we're going to talk a little bit about state advocacy as well. So when we're talking about the state level, we're really focused on the State General Assembly, sort of state senators and state representatives. You could also consider contacting the governor's office or individual departments at the state level. So for example, the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, those are all organizations that you can advocate or departments you can advocate for as well. So a few pros and cons, on the pro side at the state level, it's easier to meet directly with the decision makers at the state than the federal level. Their districts are smaller. There's more opportunity to meet directly with decision makers. If you find a champion at the state level, you have the opportunity to get a bill introduced. If your representative or your state senator is really passionate about the bill you're talking about, there's more an opportunity to introduce something. And the dollars and the impact at the state level are still very large. Not as big as the federal level, but the numbers can be really big and the impact is huge. And you also have the ability to provide written and in-person testimony on bills at the Statehouse. It's easier to navigate than the federal level, although sometimes it helps to have sort of an insider or somebody who understands this process help providing that testimony, but it's definitely a lot easier to get engaged in that way. So some of the cons at the state level, it still is a complicated and time-consuming process, especially if you have a really specific goal. Having those insiders and people who understand this can be really helpful. And it's still, like the federal level, it's still difficult to get a bill passed. There's a lot of bills that are introduced at the state level, much fewer passed, but you're, able to make more of those steps.
So let's talk about some engagement strategies for the state level government. The first is getting to know your state senator and your state representative. As mentioned, it's a lot easier to get in contact with your state Congress members than probably at the federal level. Reaching out to them while they are out of session is a really great strategy. Additionally, each of these bodies, they have a team of people. So be sure to make relationships with members of their team as well, because those folks oftentimes serves as gatekeepers or connectors in those relationships. So treat those meetings as important touch points as well. Schedule a meeting with your representative. Building off of that first statement, they're a lot easier to schedule time with, and because they have these very specific districts, you're able to get time with that person. Always, we're going to lift up plugging into a state coalition. there's a high likelihood that an issue that you're focusing on has an affiliated state coalition. It may take a little bit of research to find that coalition, but we're confident that you'll find like-minded people. As stated earlier, you can go further if you work together. So we've talked a bit about engagement at the state level, but now we'll shift gears a bit to local advocacy. And when we talk about local advocacy, oftentimes that means the mayor, city council, and the county commissioners. But there are other bodies that you can influence at the local level that carry some decision-making power, including judges. In Hamilton County, outside of the city, you have a variety of townships or separate cities, and there are resources to find the primary contacts of those places. You can also influence decisions at a hyper-local level, so connecting in with your community council if you're in the city of Cincinnati. So you have a lot of different target audiences that you can approach to advocate at the local level. As we look at some pros, even more so than at the federal and at the state level, it is very easy to get a meeting with your local member decision-making, lawmaking body. So we really encourage you to meet with those folks when you can. It may be surprising if you've navigated the city or other forms of local government, but there is significantly less bureaucracy at the local level, which creates more space for more creative solutions to solve problems. And at the local level, those issues are normally community issues. So you're not having to make a correlation between your specific community and how it impacts the larger, United States. So having that focus on a community issue is a great place to bring up at the local level. As we look at the cons, politics are more complicated at the local level. At the federal and state level, there are often we look at it as the Democratic or Republican issue, and there are caucuses created, and those legislators tend to vote in line with their caucuses. Because that doesn't exist at the local level, it may be more challenging to understand where a specific individual stands on an issue or where their passions align. So it takes a little bit more work to figure out and to know at any given time who's in support or who's against or uninformed about the issue that you're bringing up. Funds are limited, and this is connected to that government powers being more limited as well. So as we look at the funds at the local level, those are often, there's some that are restricted by state and federal regulations. So you still have the ability to influence funds and influence government, but there's typically some restrictions and regulations that even the local folks are not able to shift very much.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about some of these engagement strategies at the local level. So first, as we've said before, create those coalitions, work in those coalitions. At the local level, we encourage you to build a coalition around your issue. If you're the driver of a particular issue, you can create a coalition of local partners. To do this, think back to some of the recommendations we made earlier when we talked about thinking about what your skills and what you bring to the table and how to partner with other organizations and individuals who might have, some skills that you might not provide yourself, but try and create those coalitions of diverse partners that can bring in a lot of different aspects of the work. The second recommendation is to schedule a meeting or all the meetings. We said it was easy to schedule meetings at the local level, so it's important to build those relationships. And unlike at the federal and the state level, all of the council members represent you and all of the county commissioners represent you. So consider meeting with all of them, or at least as many as you can. I know it can be a lot. Meet with as many as you can to educate them on the issues that you care about. And finally, you can just go and speak at a council or commission meeting at the local level. Public comment is available at most of these meetings, and you can use it. So sometimes that can be enough to start a conversation on the issue that you care about. So I personally used to work at city council, and I sat through a lot of public comment, and there were so many times when council members would hear someone speak about an issue that wasn't even on the agenda, and they would connect that person on the spot with a member of their staff to start to help with that. So sometimes just speaking at those meetings can get the ball rolling on an issue that you're working on. Okay, so that was a lot of information about a lot of different levels of government. You know, that these slides will be shared at the end. So, you know, I know that that was a lot of information. If you want to go back and think about some of the recommendations that we had, you know, please, we encourage you to do that. Right now, we're going to hear a video testimonial that we had requested from an organization called Government Strategies Group. They're a lobbying firm that does work at the federal, state, and local level. And we're going to hear a story from them about how they're able to navigate and navigate this process. And they're going to talk a little bit about work at the state level.
Hi, I'm Elena Tucker, and I'll be joined by two of my colleagues, Ann and Allie. We're from Government Strategies Group, a bipartisan government affairs and economic development team in Cincinnati. We serve large and small nonprofit and for-profit clients locally and throughout the state. We help our clients solve problems, whether that means navigating bureaucracy, lobbying for or against proposed legislation, or helping amend and create needed legislation. Another way that we help our clients is through state and city operating and capital budgets. The state operating and capital budgets alternate years. The operating budget will actually be passed this week, and then the state will shift their focus to the capital budget, which will be passed in June of 2022. What does that mean for you? Locally, there's a competitive process to apply for state capital dollars. That process is administered by the Cincinnati Business Committee, the Cincinnati Regional Business Committee, and the Cincinnati Chamber, with a panel of community and business leaders all reviewing the projects starting this fall. The committee then makes a recommendation to the Hamilton County delegation. That's all our legislators from Hamilton County. They weigh in and they take the final recommendations to the Statehouse. The capital budget will be voted on by June 30th, 2022.
Okay. Who is eligible for state capital funding through the community project process? A nonprofit or municipality. Last cycle's examples include human services organizations like the Center for Addiction Treatment or Lighthouse Youth and Family Services, arts and cultural institutions like the Freedom Center and Playhouse, or local governments like the City of Cheviot for projects that benefit the community. Last cycle, over 60 projects applied for funding, totaling nearly $100 million in requests. However, Hamilton County is only allocated $20 to $22 million per cycle. About 2/3 of the projects received funding, ranging anywhere between $50,000 and over $1 million. Navigating government is hard, but it's doable. We recommend starting to reach out to your local representatives and familiarize them with your project and mission. Building a coalition of supporters from community leaders to elected officials is important to get results.
So we are very thankful to the team at Government Strategies Group for sharing that information with us. We're going to do a couple of more things before we close out today. So the folks at Government Strategies Group shared with us some resources that we're going to share back with you, including the contact information for the Hamilton County delegation at the State of Ohio government, types of projects eligible for state bond funding, as well as the 2019 capital budget application. On the screen, you'll also see the contact information for the three folks you saw featured in the video. And like I said, we'll send out this information to you. And should you have questions, comments, concerns, encourage you to reach out to that team. Additionally, we have some resources that we've pulled together that we thought may be helpful for you, including general resources around advocacy and policy, such as Stand for Your Mission, an organization or an initiative started by BoardSource about getting your board really engaged in the advocacy and policy space. We also included links to the different levels of government from the city of Cincinnati to federal government, including a list and contact information for those local jurisdictions, so townships, villages, cities in Hamilton County outside of Cincinnati. included information from government strategies groups, as well as a handful of research institutions or groups that conduct really good research. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list of all of the resources that exist in our community, but instead a way to jumpstart your thinking of who you might connect to or engage with in this process. So we open the space for questions.
Are there any aha moments, anything that kind of stuck with anybody through the presentation? I know it was a lot of information to absorb, and Holly and Janae did a great job, but was there anything that just kind of stuck with you throughout the presentation?
This is Sarah. I can offer one thing.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, the power of the story, of the individual story. I think, I know that's sometimes hard to coordinate, having a client come forward and speak at a large level. And so we often have a story we shepherd through, but understanding that actually having them be present would be a really powerful piece of lobbying is helpful for advocacy. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sarah. Any more comments? Did anyone find they need?
Tanisha, in the chat, Andrea said encouragement that we really are our own experts or in our own area is always appreciated.
Beautiful. I also wanted to add, was there any concept or idea that you needed more clarification on?
I wanted to add to something that Holly said earlier. You know, she did such a great job talking about the accessibility of Cincinnati City Council. I have watched many, many, many hours of Cincinnati City Council and public comment. And we just went through the ARPA process and the city budget process. And I love that stuff. I really enjoy it. And I listen to all the public comments. And I would say if you're, you know, at all nervous or don't know what that looks like, definitely tune in to City Cable. You can watch that online. And so then when it does come, an opportunity does come up when you want to give testimony, you feel comfortable and you understand what that process is. It's so accessible and you don't even have to watch it live. You can go back and watch an archive. And I think that speaks to the story as well. You know, we saw lots of organizations come and advocate for funding. And while it's important that the principal of your organization speaks, the CEO or whomever that is, I have found it so compelling to hear from people participating in the programs or even children that have benefited or youth. I mean, there was some great testimony given by some youth that had gone through artworks, employment, you know, people living in affordable housing, people coming out of homelessness. That is what sticks with people. Just really beautiful stories. And it was said earlier that politicians really listen to those comments, and it is very true. And while you can provide your testimony or follow up with a letter in person, you know, online, I'm sorry, I think that really that giving that in-person testimony, or in some cases Zoom testimony, is so powerful. And then I suggest to our clients, follow that up with an email with your written testimony. Just, you know, hit them again with that. You might as well, you prepared it. So just, I encourage you to participate.
Thank you so much. Definitely well said. I see that Marcia has the hand raised. Do you want to speak?
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, this all has been great information, especially for me as I'm organizing to build an advocacy base. One thing that was shared, Holly and Janae shared about the different advocacy ways to advocate and ways to communicate. And you talked about the personal story and the emails and so forth. we've often heard that if you have a very long email, they tend not to get read. And so what's a nice balance between when you're doing an effective email? So for example, you said, the canned formed emails, they kind of go, yeah, we've heard that. But how long does should an email be or communication be that's written so it gets the attention of the politicians?
I've got a little suggestion on that one. I think
Go ahead, Ann.
to write a headline in your subject matter before your email, because even if they read the headline in your first 3 sentences, that's what you want to nail. And then I do think after that it can be longer if you need it to be.
Awesome. Holly or Janae, do you have any other suggestions?
That was beautiful.
That was beautiful. I think for me, when I write emails, I like to start out with like what I want. Like the first 3 sentences are like what I want, and then the next sentences are why I want it. So that's kind of how I keep it simple.
I completely agree. That was all beautifully said. I would say if you are writing an email at the federal level, I know that those form emails, they don't always pay attention, but sometimes if they're in mass, they do. What we have been told at the federal level is if you're going to do an email on the federal level, put the bill number in the email because they code those. So make sure even if you're writing an email, it still matters to write those emails. So just make sure you're putting the bill number in the email so they can categorize it appropriately because they'll keep track of it in their database, even if they're not reading it sort of in detail.
I think that's true at the local level as well with the city and the county and then the state of Ohio. If there's a name of a piece of legislation or a bill number, absolutely, it helps the staff sort things.
Awesome. And I think Camille, you had your hand raised.
I let it down.
Okay, your question was answered.
There's a question in the chat, Denisha.
Okay. Oh yeah, are there mentors for advocates? Janae?
That is such a good question that I am really open to crowdsourcing this group of people here to see if they know of any mentors in that.
I think our All in Cincinnati Coalition serves as mentors. We definitely have a powerhouse core team that facilitates each of those sessions. And so Holly and Janae, you've been one of those facilitators. And so I think we try to create or foster an environment where we can mentor up and coming new advocates.
I would also add, I completely agree. I think going All in Cincinnati is a fabulous place to learn about this and to also find people who are working on the issues that you care about as well. So I would second that plug. I would also say that we have a small sort of informal group that we have named the Cincinnati Advocacy Collective that meets once a month via Zoom. It used to be coffee in person. Maybe we'll get back to that someday. But right now it's the Cincinnati Advocacy Collective. And it's just people who are working in this space who come together once a month who are just like chatting about what they're working on. If you have something you're struggling with and want other people to, think about, so if you're interested, I'll put my email in the chat and please reach out if you're interested in getting sort of a Zoom invitation to those meetings. You can come if you want. Like I said, it's very informal, but it's just a way to connect with other people on advocacy.
And not exactly mentorship, but in some of the resources that we highlighted, there are things like a policy toolkit that gives you some of that information, things you should consider as you're building out your platform. But I think some of the best places is, of course, tapping into those people that have been in the game for a while and get that knowledge straight from that source.
And I think if we share when we're working on various issues, for example, when the city budget's happening, unlike, during COVID, typically a lot of us are hanging around. And if we start seeing each other in city council chambers and what are you working on, we can share information that we've heard.
That's okay, Ann, you can finish.
No, I was just, we can share information, gossip, what we're hearing.
Gossip.
What. So I think those informal conversations too, I really like Holly's concept of meeting, informally as a group, sharing important the important work we're all doing on behalf of the city and our constituents would be just terrific. So keeping up, going in person when you can, getting to know folks so you can tap your network of people as well.
Yes, great point, Ann. And I think we have one last question in the chat, and it's a long one, so give me a second. Are there any organizations that act as translators? I find it difficult to plug in because I miss announcements of proposed legislation or being proposed until it is already passed, or with barely enough time to communicate with affected persons so that they can share their stories with decision makers, both at the state and city level. So are there any translators? The short of the question.
I would suggest, especially at the state level, there are often advocacy organizations, depending on your constituency or the issue that you're working on. If you want to, you can send me a quick, I'll put my email in the chat and I can see if there's, at the state level, often you'll have a network of nonprofits who will be able to connect you to what's happening in your language.
I'm sorry, I put translators in quotes because it's not actually a language barrier. It's
I see.
Government speak to layperson speak, where I will get an email from the city about, because I'm on my community council, about like what the planning commission is going to discuss on Friday. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I don't know if what you're talking about affects my neighborhood. And so then I feel like I'm disappointing my neighborhood because I'm not able to tell my neighborhood, hey, here's what's happening.
Well, for that example, I would call the city planning staff, because they are required to notify every neighborhood that is impacted by an upcoming vote and decision. I sit on planning commission, so I can tell you, they really seek neighborhood input. So that means there's a development or a project or a zoning change happening in your neighborhood. And if you can't understand it, call the number, call the staff, and they can explain it to you in English. That's their job. I'm with you. It's very confusing, some of the information that's sent. Yeah.
Holly, did you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I would add to that is really plugging into listservs or other resources connected to the issues that you're passionate about at the level of government that you're passionate about. And oftentimes those groups will do some work in translating that information for you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, a lot of the coalitions, like we talked about coalitions, the state coalitions that are working on the issues, or the national ones, if you just sign up for their listservs, their email addresses on the issues you care about, you'll get information around upcoming bills. We're part of the Ohio Women's Public Policy Network, which is a statewide organization that focuses on sort of women's economic self-sufficiency and other women's issues. And they do a great job of tracking those pieces of legislation. And they send an email every week with bills that have been introduced and how they impact women and families in Ohio. So that's just one example, but there's several organizations. And I imagine on whatever issues you care about, there'll be organizations that align with that.
And then Kate, also at the local level, are you connected with the community council? Is that what you mean by your neighborhood when you made that? You can always have a staff member, actually from a city council member, come to present to a community council meeting on whatever issue you're interested in to provide more clarification.
Yes, but right now the barrier is that I don't even know. Because I get the emails about like, here's what we're doing in the planning. And I'm like,
what does that mean?
Cool, right. And so I don't know if it's worth their time to come talk to our neighborhood because I have no idea if what was in that email affects my neighborhood. So that's just, yeah. And at this time, our current board makeup, none of us are really versed enough in that kind of content. We're all volunteers and we're all not full-time politician legislative minds. So it's just been a challenge.
That makes me think that maybe this is a systems change that we can work on. One of our core team members is Invested Neighborhoods. So maybe we can look to see how
they are wonderful, and they are they are holding me on by a thread because there are times when I'm like, wait, what's happening? And then I'll get an email from Invested Neighborhoods and I'm like, Oh, okay.
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's something like that, but I think there's still, I think maybe, I don't know. There's still something missing and I don't know what it is yet, but maybe it's just that I need to more tap into, maybe it's a personal, capacity challenge and just finding the ability to plug in more with invested neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think
And I
that might
hate
be
to
a
do
great
this.
system.
I realize we're at
I know
time.
time, yes.
This is a really great conversation, but we want to get this last bit of information out to folks should they be hopping off right now.
All right, so our upcoming sessions, the next session, session 3, is advocacy work. So we're gonna be giving you some successes from the field, and you can actually get to join the All In Cincinnati Coalition meeting. And our mission is to dismantle racial inequities in our 5 primary areas of health, housing, education, economic mobility, and justice, with a goal to uplift Black women in Hamilton County. So after that, we'll have session 4, which is to develop a plan. So we'll help you guys develop a plan. And then session 5 will be the Cincinnati Candidate Forum. So thank you so much for joining the meeting today. Yes, the slides will be sent out, as well as the slides for the first training. So thank you again. Sorry for going over. I will follow up with you offline, Kate, to see if we can create a system change. Great meeting today. Have a great rest of your day. See you in August.